we're very pleased to be joined by the former Director of Central Intelligence, James Woolsey. He's also chairman for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and also joining in the conversation, the Executive Director for the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Gentlemen, to you both, we welcome you to America's Forum. Jim, let's begin with you. Maybe it's time to get out the science book. Let's talk about EMP, how it would be introduced and how it might work.
Well, one of the confusing things about EMP is that it occurs naturally, in a sense. The sun has been bombarding the Earth with high-powered radio waves, essentially electromagnetic pulses, for billions of years. It was only in the early 1960s, when we still did some atmospheric nuclear testing, that we began to understand that an electromagnetic pulse formed by a nuclear detonation up, let's say, on a satellite in low Earth orbit, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles up in space, and a detonation there would fry electronics hundreds, even thousands of miles away. The problem is that electronics today are 1,000,000 times more vulnerable than electronics were in the early 1960s when we did those atmospheric tests. And as a result, if somebody, anybody, launches a very simple, small nuclear weapon into orbit and using a simple ballistic missile, a Scud, and detonates that when it is on orbit, up at a height of 50 miles, let's say, it could knock out all of the electronics underneath it, including all the way out to the horizon for some electronics, and the transformers and that are in electric grids, even if they're thousands of miles from the detonation, because the long wavelength waves travel along the transmission lines of our electric grid. The big problem is that we've got 18 critical infrastructures in the United States, and 17 of them depend on the 18th, which is electricity. So if the electric grid goes down because there's been a detonation, let's say, of a nuclear weapon up in orbit by Iran, North Korea, Russia, anybody, we could well have the end of the functioning of all of our infrastructure. And that means huge numbers dying of thirst, starving, and the rest. It's a hideous possibility.
Jim, as you were relaying these things, we pointed to an article on our parent website, newsmax.com, going into some of the things you were just discussing. Let me turn to Peter now, checking in from St. Paul this morning. Peter, we've heard Jim explain the whys and wherefores, and really a kind of electronically deprived, slow death, possibly for a lot of Americans. And Jim outlined any number of possible perpetrators. I'm curious, you never want to assume things about adversaries, but ISIS or ISIL being so provocative in its pronouncements, is there any danger that a group like ISIS could get its hands on a relatively simple device and use it against the United States in this way?
Well, yes. The Congressional EMP Commission, in which I served as early as 2008, was concerned about a possibility like that, about terrorists getting hold of a nuclear weapon, because all you need to deliver it to the altitudes that Ambassador Woolsey was describing is a simple missile like a Scud missile. We have seen that ISIS has actually paraded a short-range ballistic missile that has got its hands on that. You know, what it would need is a nuclear warhead. And there are irresponsible states in the world, like North Korea and Iran. If Iran develops nuclear weapons, it's the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism.
So you mentioned some nation states and also the possibility of a group like ISIS as it tries to establish a modern caliphate. Jim, in your role when you were Director of Central Intelligence, you had to deal with daily threat assessments. EMP, the dangers I've heard about back when I was first elected to Congress, now almost 20 years ago. In your opinion, in terms of a threat assessment, is EMP the technological low-hanging fruit that might be more available than just about anything else?
That's probably a pretty good way to put it, because it can be launched even with a weather balloon that can get up to, say 20, 30 miles above the Earth. And a detonation would cause huge blackouts in the area right beneath it. And if it's higher than that, say up at 80, 90, 100 miles, the blackouts of our electronics could essentially cover the entire continental United States. So we need to fix this, and it's not that expensive to make the changes in our electric grid and put in some surge arresters and the right types of equipment to at least keep the entire grid from going down. Probably for another several $billion. We would need that in order to make some changes in some of our infrastructure and to do a better job. But we could keep this terrible disaster from happening with an expenditure of a couple of $1 billion. And that is a very small amount of money given the huge risk that we are bearing now with no protection for our civilian economy. Our military, strategic military capabilities, some of them have some protection, but our civilian economy has none.
And Jim, as you were mentioning that, our viewers got a chance to see the column that you and Peter co-authored for the Wall Street Journal, The Growing Threat from an EMP Attack. Peter, to you, we heard Jim touch on a possible solution that is, in the world of billions and billions of dollars, even with the challenge we face fiscally, fairly economical. Is there a course of action our Commander-in-Chief and Congress should take today to deal with that EMP threat, and could you go into a bit more detail?
Certainly. And I would add that this EMP threat is not merely theoretical, but it's real. Open source Iranian military writings talk about taking out the United States with an EMP to eliminate us as an actor on the world stage. North Korea apparently practiced an EMP attack against the United States by orbiting its KSM-3 satellite at the optimum altitude for such an attack just last year. Now, solutions are in front of Congress. The SHIELD Act, for example, would provide authorization to the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to require the electric utilities to protect themselves against EMP. Last year, another bill was introduced called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act that would require the Department of Homeland Security to start planning for a catastrophic natural or nuclear EMP event. But the greatest hope, because we frankly haven't made that much progress in Washington. A lot of these bills have been stalled in the Congress. Washington is so broken that lobbyists who don't want to have extra regulation on the electric power industry have been able to stop progress on these bills. However, at the state level, the states are running out of patience with Washington, and we've had several states launch their own initiatives to protect the grids of their own states in Maine, Virginia, and Arizona, and other states are starting to follow their lead.
Well, it's interesting to think about that kind of direct action by the several states. Jim, in terms of a commander-in-chief stepping up regardless of party or name, given the situation we face right now, is this something President Obama should have championed, starting yesterday or at the outset of his term? Has he said anything about this? Has he been willing to weigh in as commander-in-chief on this? We've got about a minute left, a little less than a minute.
To the best of my knowledge, he's done nothing, and the Department of Homeland Security is doing nothing. The Defense Department is protecting some of its own equipment, but not the country's infrastructure. And the lobbyists for some of the power companies are basically continuing to make it dangerous for 200 million Americans, which is one of the casualty estimates from the EMP Commission, by their lobbying in ensuring that we don't have any effective changes and improvements in our power grid.
We will have to leave it there. Gentlemen, we thank you for your time this morning, also your piece in the Wall Street Journal, and America's Forum continues following this.